Gordon Parks is considered to be one of the greatest photographers of all time. He is known for his distinct style, his compassionate approach to the medium, and for breaking the color line in professional photography. Much of his work has been influenced by his commitment to social justice, the civil rights movement, and the African American experience. Gordon Alexander Buchanan Parks was born into poverty in Fort Scott, Kansas in 1912. Using a camera, he documented American life and culture from the early 1940s into the early 2000s. His work primarily focused on race relations, poverty, civil rights, and general life of the time period. He often worked with well-known individuals like Duke Ellington, Kwame Ture, Muhammad Ali, and Barbra Streisand. Parks was considered to be a Renaissance man. On top of being a prolific photographer, he was also a composer, an author, and a filmmaker. Parks first became interested in the photographic medium when he saw images of migrant workers in a magazine. After teaching himself how to use a camera he purchased at a pawn shop in 1937, Parks went on to experiment with portraiture. Some of his images were published in an African American newspaper produced in St. Paul, Minnesota, which is where he also began working as a professional photographer for the fashion section of Frank Murphy's, a local department store. He continued to photograph fashion throughout his career, going on to be featured in Vogue and Glamour magazines. Very early on in his career, he met Marva Trotter Lewis, a fashion designer, a socialite, and the wife of Joe Louis, a famous heavyweight boxer. She became an avid supporter of Parks and his photographic skills, even encouraging him to move to Chicago in the early 1940s. This move led him to photograph Langston Hughes, a leader of the Harlem Renaissance movement who addressed important racial issues through his essays, poetry, and plays. While in Chicago, he documented the impoverished South Side, for which he went on to receive the Julius Rosenwald Fellowship in 1942 when he was only 30 years old. In his application, he stated his aim was to sympathetically portray the Negro in his intellectual, professional, educational, social, farm, and urban life, constituting thereby not one strata of society, but rather a record showing all sides of the life of our people. This fellowship led to a position at the Farm Security Administration and the Office of War Information. The Farm Security Administration was created by President Theodore Roosevelt in 1937 to aid those struggling during the Great Depression, especially farmers, sharecroppers, and migrant workers. The program advocated for planning and economic intervention in rural American towns to help improve living conditions, although some attacked it as being socialistic. The Farm Security Administration included a photographic unit to document both rural poverty and the government's efforts to assist in these trying times. The group of photographers selected for this program were all very well-known image makers of the 20th century, including Dorothea Lange, Walker Evans, Arthur Rothstein, and Ben Shahn. The Farm Security Administration was eventually absorbed into the Office of War Information in late 1942. This was a propaganda agency during the early days of World War II, and it used the photographic unit to document aircraft factories, servicemen, and women workers. Gordon Parks arrived in Washington, D.C. in 1942 to work for the Farm Security Administration, although he was unfortunately met with discrimination while attempting to photograph the area. Local restaurants, theaters, and department stores turned him away during his stay. Of these experiences in Washington, Parks had said, "In this radiant, historic place, racism was rampant." He found a breakthrough in his career when he met Ella Watson, who was a janitor at the Farm Security Administration offices. She told him about her life and allowed him to photograph her, her home, and her community for 4 months. During this time, Parks was able to see and understand the reality of Black life in the nation's capital. His most well-known image from this series is of Miss Watson standing in front of the American flag, holding a broom and mop. It reinterprets the 1930 painting by Grant Wood of the same name. Both American Gothic pieces attempt to connect people to national issues of their time. In late 1942, the Farm Security Administration was abolished and the photography unit was absorbed by the Office of War Information. Parks was assigned as a war correspondent, and he documented the 1st Regiment of Black pilots to serve in the American Army's Air Corps, who were known as the 332nd Fighter Group. The group of pilots trained near Detroit, Michigan, and Selfridge Field. His photographs capture the danger of preparing for war, but he was unable to document their first deployments abroad. He was continually left out of documenting these historical moments because many officials in the federal government did not want Black pilots receiving any publicity. Because of this, his photographs only document the pilots' trainings and preparations. While continuing to photograph for the Office of War Information, Parks was assigned to document the fishing industry on the Atlantic coast. This was part of a larger documentary on food production during the war. While in Gloucester, Massachusetts, Parks documented the town that is home to one of the nation's oldest fishing communities. His images show the historic port and the individuals who are hard at work to support the war effort. After documenting the fishermen in Massachusetts, he went on to New York City to photograph those working in the Fulton Fish Market on the southeast waterfront. Here, Parks was able to capture the fast-paced work environment, the bustling life on the pier, and the city skyline that surrounded them. In the mid-1940s, Parks began working for Standard Oil. One of his first projects through the company was to make images of the grease workers plant in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Because of the poor lighting conditions inside the factories, Parks was able to produce images with an intense contrast. This approach created dynamic photographs of the repeating elements within the scenes. Parks wrote to his former Farm Security Administration colleague Roy Stryker about the awful conditions within the grease plant. His most notable image from this series features a young man surrounded by barrels, drums, and rising steam. This young worker is the only human presence in the photograph, and Parks's low angle presents him as a hero of industry. Parks continued to work for Standard Oil. Because of the country's reliance on oil and lubricants during the war effort, he was assigned to document those working in the transportation industry in New York City. He explored the life and experiences of working people between 1944 and 1948. He produced an extensive series of images featuring direct and honest portraiture, as well as the geometry in the industrial buildings of the time period. These were some of the last images Parks made while employed by Standard Oil. He eventually moved on to working on documentary projects for magazines. This photograph was made for Ebony magazine in 1947. It shows a child participating in Mamie and Kenneth Clark's doll test, which investigated how segregation affected self-esteem in Black children. The test ultimately revealed that segregation impacted children's feelings of self-worth. It was later used to assist in school desegregation, including in Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. Gordon Parks proposed his first story to Life magazine in 1948. The piece was to cover the gang wars that were consuming Harlem, although Parks would have to gain their trust in order to photograph them. After meeting Red Jackson, the leader of a gang called the Midtowners, Parks spent weeks getting to know them, their territory, and their loyalty codes before even taking out his camera. One of the most well-known images from this series is of Red Jackson peeking out of a window after being ambushed during a funeral. Parks and Jackson took refuge in an abandoned building to escape a rival gang called the Sabres. It was this photograph that solidified a career at Life, making him the first Black staffer to work at the magazine. The Montgomery bus boycott was a civil rights protest that began in 1955. It is considered to be the first large-scale demonstration against segregation in the United States. Life magazine asked Parks to go to Alabama to document the racial tensions in the area. While in Alabama, he met Willie Causey, a local man who had allowed Parks to photograph his family at home and at work. Eventually, he was able to meet 4 generations of the Causey family, who he photographed on their homestead. While working with the Causey family, Life asked Parks to photograph the separate but equal facilities of the area. These were a divisive result of the Jim Crow laws, creating separate drinking fountains, bathrooms, and store entrances for Black Americans. This oppressive law was first codified in 1896 in Plessy v. Ferguson. The ruling signaled the federal government's unwilling to challenge segregation or the oppression of Black people in the South. Not only were Black Americans forced to abide by these heinous and demeaning laws, but they were also met with poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses that prevented them from voting, being ineligible to serve on a jury, or running for office. If they attempted to find equal footing in the form of protest or civil disobedience, they were often met with extreme violence. The story about the Causey family appears in the September 24, 1956 issue of Life magazine. After its publication, the family suffered cruel treatment. They were ripped from their possessions and chased out of their home. Parks made it his mission to make sure the magazine provided the family with the support they needed to get back on their feet. As the civil rights movement continued into the 1960s, Life magazine sought to cover the Black Muslim movement. Parks was the only Black member of the staff and was asked to document the group. Parks was first introduced to the most renowned member of the group, Malcolm X. He was able to introduce himself after hearing a speech in Harlem, only to find that Malcolm X already knew who he was. Parks was eventually introduced to Elijah Muhammad, who agreed to the article. This series is considered one of Parks's most groundbreaking pieces as he documented every aspect of the Black Muslim community. He was able to photograph children and their families attending prayer to self-defense drills for the group. Parks was also able to obtain intense portraits of both Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad. Beyond creating powerful photographs, Parks also wrote poignant and personal pieces about race relations in the United States. Shortly after his time working with the Black Muslim community, Malcolm X was ostracized by the Nation of Islam. He was assassinated on February 21, 1965. During this time, Parks also photographed the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom during August of 1963. This historical moment consisted of demonstrators from all over the United States. They gathered in front of the Lincoln Memorial to protest continuing inequalities faced by Black Americans. Parks not only captured the large crowd in attendance, but also Martin Luther King Jr., who was one of the hopeful and charismatic leaders of the movement. Here he is delivering his important and iconic I Have a Dream speech. While his photography is something that Gordon Parks is most well known for, he also created a plethora of work outside of the medium. Between the mid-1960s and the mid-1970s, he worked on various films including The Learning Tree in 1969 and the famous feature-length film Shaft in 1971. He had learned piano at a young age and performed music as a child and teenager. Later in life, he composed a ballet that he dedicated to the life of Martin Luther King Jr. After writing articles and personal notations in the 1940s, Parks furthered this ability when he began writing poetry. This led to the publication of 3 books of poems between the late 1960s and mid-2000s. He also acted as co-founder of the women's lifestyle magazine Essence in 1970, where he served as the editorial director for the first 3 years. Art Kane photographed 57 jazz musicians surrounding a brownstone in Harlem for Esquire magazine in 1958. The issue examined the evolution of the genre since the Harlem Renaissance, as the neighborhood had been notable for its American sound of jazz. In 1998, much later in Parks's career, XXL magazine asked him to photograph 117 hip-hop artists, producers, and influencers on the stoop of the same brownstone that Kane had photographed 40 years prior. Some notable names include Fat Joe, Busta Rhymes, and Slick Rick. Gordon Parks' legacy lives on today. In 2017, rapper Kendrick Lamar produced a music video for the song Element from his album entitled Damn, alongside director Jonas Lindstrom and Dave Free. If you watch the music video, you might recognize some of the images from Gordon Parks' repertoire, seemingly bringing the images to life. By recreating Parks' iconic images in his video, Lamar is calling attention to the most important photographer of our time. Lamar is also carrying Parks' mantle by continuing to force America to confront its still racist reality. Because of the success surrounding the video and the use of Parks' photographs, the Gordon Parks Foundation opened an exhibition called Element, Gordon Parks and Kendrick Lamar in Pleasantville, New York. Peter W. Kunhart, the executive director of the foundation, said that Gordon Parks' work is continuing to have a great impact on young people, and particularly on artists like Kendrick, who use the power of imagery to examine issues related to social justice and race in our country. Record producer and friend of Kendrick Lamar, Swizz Beatz, also called the video a prime example of how contemporary changemakers, artists, musicians, filmmakers, and designers can borrow from the greats of the past who were also working towards social change. Of his approach to photography, Gordon Parks had said, "I saw that the camera could be a weapon against poverty, against racism, against all sorts of social wrongs. I knew at that point I had to have a camera." Gordon Parks' work has reached a wide audience because of his beautiful and compelling representation of difficult subject matter. His eye for photographic design, light, and composition have offered an evocative view of many major moments in the history of the United States, from the Great Depression to segregation to the Civil Rights Movement and on. Gordon Parks leaves behind a legacy not only through his photographic projects, but in the unique and compassionate way that he saw the world. Thank you.